Walk through any European city at 8 in the morning. You see two things at the same time: crowded universities and help wanted signs. Lecture halls are full, companies are hiring, and somehow both sides complain. Students say there are no good jobs. Firms say we cannot find qualified people, which is strange because we've never been more educated. More degrees, more certificates, more years in classrooms. And yet, productivity growth, the thing that actually determines wages and prosperity, keeps slowing down. It's one of the quietest contradictions of modern politics. We educate more, we grow less. So tonight we ask an uncomfortable question. What if education isn't broken because we spend too little, but because we misunderstand what it's supposed to do? Welcome to The Price of Policy. I'm Matthias Rieger. This is a podcast about politics and economics, and about the costs that quietly accumulate once policies turn into slogans. Politics loves promises. Economics keeps the receipts. Tonight, education. Not as a moral promise, but as an economic system. Education is the one policy area everyone agrees on. Left or right, market or state, progressive or conservative. Everyone says the same thing. Just educate more. Spend more. Build campuses. Add programs. Expand access. And productivity will follow. It's a comforting belief because it suggests growth is simply a question of goodwill and budgets. Just invest in schools and prosperity appears. But productivity has never been impressed by intentions. It only responds to incentives, skills, and application. And that's where the story gets messy. Let's start with an uncomfortable fact. Over the past decades, educational attainment has exploded. More people finish secondary school. More go to university. More degrees than ever before. And yet, across most advanced economies, productivity growth has slowed. Not accelerated, slowed. That's not a coincidence. It's a contradiction. Because education does not automatically create skills. And skills do not automatically create productivity. There's a missing link. Relevance. Listen. You can't power an economy with diplomas that don't plug into reality. Modern education systems are exceptionally good at producing one thing: credentials. Diplomas, certificates, titles. Because credentials are measurable. Competence isn't. It's easy to count graduates. It's hard to measure whether someone can actually solve real problems under pressure. Exams test memory. Markets test application. Modern economies rarely reward knowledge in isolation. They reward problem solving under constraints. An engineer rarely receives a nearly defined exam question. They receive a malfunctioning system, incomplete information, time pressure, and a cost constraint. A hospital administrator does not face a multiple choice test. They face staffing shortages, regulatory rules, and limited budgets. A logistics manager is not asked to repeat theory. They must move goods across continents while ports close and supply chains shift. Real productivity emerges in environments where knowledge must be translated into action. And that translation is messy. It requires experience, iteration, failure, feedback, most of which happens outside classrooms, which means a purely academic system risks producing people who understand the theory of systems but have never operated one. And when that gap widens, something strange happens in labor markets. Graduates feel underutilized. Employers feel underserved. Both are correct. Because the system optimized for certification, not capability. So what happens? Education drifts toward what is easy to test. Standardized knowledge. Predictable answers. Safe performance. But real productivity requires messy skills. Judgment. Adaptation. Execution. Problem solving under uncertainty. Things you don't capture in multiple choice tests. So education slowly turns into a signaling game. A way to prove endurance and conformity, not necessarily capability. And then we get the paradox. Graduates without applicable skills. Firms without qualified applicants. And politicians calling for more funding instead of asking whether we are funding the wrong things. Let's zoom out. Because this isn't anecdotal, it's structural. Across the European Union, public spending on education is roughly 5% of GDP. That's hundreds of billions of euros every year. Education is already one of the largest budget items most governments have. At the same time, more than 40% of young Europeans now enter tertiary education. Historically unprecedented. Never in human history have so many people spent so many years in formal schooling. And yet, productivity growth across Europe has remained sluggish for over a decade. So this clearly isn't a simple not enough spending problem. We are not starving education. We are already investing massively, which means the issue isn't quantity, it's alignment. What are we actually producing with all that time and money? There's also a cultural bias nobody likes to talk about. Academic paths are celebrated. Vocational paths are tolerated. University is success. Apprenticeships are plan B. Parents push children toward degrees. Even when the labor market screams for technicians, machinists, electricians, engineers, skills that maintain infrastructure, operate complex systems, translate innovation into production. Productivity doesn't grow in lecture halls alone. It grows where theory meets execution. Listen, an economy can't run on essays when it needs engineers. Let's bring in evidence. Across Europe, surveys of employees repeatedly show the same complaint. Not a lack of graduates, a lack of the right skills. OECD and EU labor market studies estimate that around 1 in 3 workers is either overqualified or underqualified for their job. Economists describe this as a human capital misallocation. And misallocation is one of the most persistent drags on productivity. Imagine investing billions into infrastructure, roads, ports, railways, and then connecting them to the wrong places. The roads exist. The spending happens, but the network fails to generate value. Labor markets can suffer from the same problem. Workers with years of education end up performing tasks that require far less training, while positions that require specific technical skills remain vacant. The result is a paradoxical combination of graduate underemployment and technical skills shortages, both happening simultaneously. From a macroeconomic perspective, this is equivalent to running a factory where half the machines are idle while the other half lack operators. The capacity exists, but it is badly organized. And when that misalignment persists for years, it lowers the overall productivity of the entire economy. Not because people are incapable, but because their skills are deployed inefficiently. Think about that. Years of education, massive public spending, and a third of people are mismatched. Either their skills aren't used, or they never learned what the job actually requires. That's not just inefficient, it's economically expensive. Because mismatched workers are less productive, less satisfied, less innovative. Education isn't just failing some people. It's misallocating human capital at scale. And misallocation is the quiet killer of growth. Another blind spot: incentives. Education systems often operate in isolation from outcomes. Funding follows enrollment, not employability. Institutions are rewarded for expansion, not effectiveness. Students are encouraged to accumulate years, not market value. So, what's the rational response for universities? Grow, add programs, enroll more people. Regardless of whether the labor market needs those graduates, there's no feedback loop, no price signal, no correction mechanism. So education becomes self-referential, responsive to ideology, not demand. And then we're surprised when graduates struggle to find productive roles. Even when education policy works, it works slowly, very slowly. Skills do not appear overnight. A good engineer takes years to train. A skilled technician, even longer. Not because the material is difficult, but because mastery requires repetition, practice, failure, correction. The kind of learning that only accumulates over time. And even after education produces skilled workers, the economic effects still take time to appear, because productivity is not simply the sum of individual skills. It is the interaction between skills, capital, and organization. A new graduate entering the labor market does not immediately transform an industry. They learn, they adapt, they gain experience. Only years later do they become the kind of worker who improves systems rather than simply operating them. Which means education policy operates on extremely long timelines, 10 years, sometimes 20. But political cycles are short, 4 years, sometimes less. That mismatch creates a powerful illusion. Education becomes the perfect political promise. It sounds responsible. It sounds future-oriented. And most importantly, it postpones evaluation. Announce education reforms today. Expand universities' access. Increase funding. Introduce new programs. And the results, if they appear at all, will emerge far beyond the current election cycle. In other words, education policy offers something rare in politics: credit now, accountability later, which encourages a specific pattern. Governments announce new education initiatives almost every few years. Curriculum reforms, expansion programs, each presented as a solution to the future economy. But structural problems inside education systems often remain untouched. Misaligned incentives, outdated curricula, weak connections between schools and firms, because those problems are harder to solve, and they produce fewer immediate headlines. So instead of fixing the system, we keep announcing reforms, new strategies layered on top of old structures, new programs built on outdated incentives, and over time, the system becomes more complex without becoming more effective. Meanwhile, the labor market continues to evolve. Technologies change, industries transform, new skills become necessary, and education systems struggle to adapt at the same speed. Not because teachers are incapable, but because large public systems move slowly. Which means the gap between education and economic reality can quietly widen. Graduates arrive with knowledge designed for yesterday's economy. Firms search for skills needed for tomorrow's, and both sides feel frustrated. Students feel betrayed by promises of opportunity. Employers feel abandoned by institutions meant to prepare workers. But the real problem lies in the timeline mismatch. Education moves in decades. Politics moves in election cycles. Politics moves in election cycles. And when policy ignores that difference, expectations become unrealistic. Education can support growth, but it cannot deliver economic miracles on political schedules. Here's a neglected truth. Most productivity growth doesn't come from schools. It comes from firms, from on-the-job training, better processes, new machinery, organizational improvements, capital deepening. Education supplies potential. Firms convert it into output. This is why some countries consistently outperforms others with similar education levels. Because what matters is not only how people are educated, but where they work afterwards. A highly educated workforce placed in low productivity firms cannot generate high productivity. But moderately educated workers inside highly productive firms often outperform expectations. Economists sometimes call this the firm effect. The idea that productivity differences between companies explain a large share of overall economic performance. Some firms are simply better at organizing work, better at adapting technology, better at training employees on the job. When those firms expand, productivity rises. When they stagnate, even well-educated workers cannot compensate. Education creates capability, but organizations determine whether that capability is used, which means growth policy cannot stop at schools. It must reach the firms where productivity actually happens. Without firms, education is just stored possibility, which means if companies can't invest, skills don't translate to growth. Listen, if companies can't invest, schools can't save productivity. Let's look at an historical example. In the second half of the 20th century, the Soviet Union had one of the most educated populations in the world. The state invested heavily in science and engineering education. Universities produced enormous numbers of graduates in mathematics, physics, and technical disciplines. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union was training more engineers per year than the United States. In raw educational terms, the system looked impressive. Highly educated workers, large research institutes, strong theoretical training. On paper, it looked like the perfect foundation for productivity growth. But the results were very different. Despite this massive investment in education, Soviet productivity remained far below that of Western economics. Factories were inefficient. Technology diffusion was slow. Innovation rarely translated into consumer goods or industrial improvements. The knowledge existed, the productivity did not. The problem was not the skills of workers. It was the system they operated in. Firms had little incentive to innovate. Managers were rewarded for meeting production targets, not improving efficiency. Competition barely existed, and failure carried political risks. So engineers often designed improvements that were never implemented. Research institutes produced theoretical breakthroughs that never reached factories. Workers had education, but the economic environment could not absorb their knowledge. The Soviet Union demonstrated something important about productivity. Education can create human capital, but only institutions and firms can turn that capital into economic output. Without incentives for experimentation, investment, and organizational change, knowledge remains potential, not productivity. Listen, the Soviet Union did not lack educated people. It lacked a system capable of turning education into productivity. Again, a large share of productivity growth does not come from simply having more educated workers. It comes from how firms organize and deploy those workers. Economists studying thousands of companies across different countries consistently find enormous productivity differences between firms operating in the same industry. Same country, same regulations, same labor market. And yet, some firms produce 2 or 3 times as much output per worker as others. The difference is rarely explained by formal education levels alone. Instead, the gap often comes from management practices. How work is organized, how decisions are made, how quickly firms adopt new technologies, how effectively they train employees on the job. In other words, productivity is not just a property of workers. It's a property of organization. Take technology adoption. 2 companies may buy the same machine, the same software, the same automation system, but one integrates it into production smoothly. Workers receive training. Processes are redesigned. Output rises. The other installs the same machine and struggles. Employees are unsure how to use it. All processes remain unchanged. The potential productivity gain never materializes. The technology exists, but the organization cannot absorb it. Economists sometimes describe this as absorptive capacity, the ability of firms to turn knowledge into output. And that capacity is built over time through management quality, through internal training, through experience, not just through formal schooling. This is why some countries with similar education levels still show very different productivity outcomes. Because education supplies the raw material. Firms determine how efficiently that material is used. Think of it like energy. Education creates potential energy, skills stored in human capital. But potential energy does nothing by itself. It must be converted into motion. And that conversion happens inside companies, through investment, through organization, through leadership. Without firms capable of doing that conversion, education remains unused potential. Which explains another paradox. You can increase university enrollment for decades and still see weak productivity growth. Because the bottleneck is not the supply of educated workers. It's the capacity of firms to transform those workers' knowledge into productive output. And when policymakers misunderstand that relationship, they make a predictable mistake. They try to solve productivity problems exclusively through education policy. More universities, more degrees, more academic programs. But productivity growth requires something else as well. Healthy firms, competitive markets, investment in capital and technology, and organizations capable of turning knowledge into results. No matter how well educated a workforce becomes, productivity will stagnate if the firms employing them cannot translate knowledge into production. Education provides the ingredients. Firms cook the meal. And an economy full of ingredients without functional kitchens does not produce prosperity. Now connect that to Europe specifically. Small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, make up over 99% of all businesses in the EU. The structure shapes how skills are actually used. Large corporations often run internal training programs, dedicated HR departments, formal career paths. Small firms operate differently. A medium-sized manufacturer might employ 50 or 100 people. Training often happens directly on the job. Skills are transferred informally. Experienced workers mentor younger ones. Knowledge accumulates through practice, which means the education system cannot operate as a completely separate world. If schools produce graduates who are unfamiliar with real production environments, SMEs must invest additional time and resources just to make them operational. Some firms absorb that cost. Many cannot. And when they cannot, vacancies remain open. Not because workers don't exist, but because the transition from school to productive employment is too slow or too uncertain. In that sense, education policy and industrial structure are inseparable. You cannot design one without understanding the other. And they employ roughly 2/3 of the private workforce. That's where most people actually work. Not in research labs, not in ministries, in small and medium firms. And these firms constantly report skill shortages in technical and vocational areas. Not philosophy graduates, not general degrees, concrete, applicable skills. So if education policy ignores the need of SMEs, it ignores the actual economy. It's like training pilots when what you need are mechanics. Looks impressive. Doesn't keep the system running. The real cost isn't unemployment. It's misalignment. People spending years learning things they never use. Firms spending years searching for skills that never appear. That's lost time, lost productivity, lost growth. Not dramatic, just quite waste. Which is often worse, because it doesn't trigger alarm bells. It just slowly lowers living standards. A serious approach would look different. It would treat vocational and academic paths as equal, not hierarchical. It would link funding to outcomes, not attendance. It would integrate firms directly into training, not isolate education from markets. It would update curricula faster than political talking points. And most importantly, it would stop pretending education alone can compensate for bad economic policy. Because skills flourish where effort pays, capital forms, risk-taking is rewarded, and firms are free to invest. Without that environment, even the best schools can't create growth. Education is essential, but it is not magic. If degrees multiply while productivity stalls, the problem isn't effort, it's alignment. More years in classroom don't automatically mean more prosperity. Growth happens where skills meet incentives, where firms invest, where knowledge turns into output. If we want real prosperity, we need fewer comforting myths and more uncomfortable connections between education, markets, and reality. Next episode, the welfare state. Work incentives and why compassion without conditions erodes productivity. Politics loves promises, economics keeps the receipts. I'm Matthias Rieger. Thanks for listening.